I still remember the sound of that slap, the way it echoed through my quiet living room like thunder on a calm day. I never thought my daughter-in-law, the woman I once welcomed with open arms, could ever raise her hand at me. It wasn't just the sting on my cheek that hurt. It was the crack that split through my heart. My name is Mary Walker. I live in a small town in Oregon, a peaceful place with winding roads and kind neighbors. I lost my husband Tom years ago, and since then I've lived alone in this little house filled with memories. Every corner carries his laughter. Every window holds the sunsets we used to watch together. When my son Michael got married, I was overjoyed. I wanted so much to love his wife Sarah the way I had loved him from the moment he was born. I cooked for them. I helped set up their first apartment. I gave them every bit of warmth a mother could give. I thought we were a family, but life has a way of testing even the kindest hearts. It all began quietly, like most storms do at Fee. RST Sarah was sweet, polite, always calling me Mom. She would visit with Michael every Sunday, bringing flowers or pastries. I loved her like a daughter, but soon things changed. She started acting distant, complaining that the house was too old, that I was too involved in their lives. I tried not to take it to heart. I thought maybe she just needed time. Then Michael lost his job. The economy had been rough that year, and he came to me one evening, his voice heavy with worry. He said, Mom, Sarah and I need a place to stay just for a little while, until we get back on our feet. I looked at my son's tired face and said, Of course, my boy, this house is your home always. They moved in that weekend. At first, it was peaceful. We had dinners together. We watched old movies. We laughed late into the night. But slowly, I began to feel something shift. Sarah started taking over the kitchen, rearranging things, scolding me for how I kept the pantry one morning. She said, Maybe it's time you let us handle the house, Mom. You've dished. One enough, I tried to smile and said, I'm happy to help, Sarah. This is still my home after all. She gave a small forced smile and walked away. Days turned into weeks. The air grew heavy in the house. I heard them arguing at night about money, about me. Michael always tried to calm her, but her voice would rise sharp and cold. I stayed quiet, praying that kindness would heal what was breaking inside our family. Then came that afternoon, the one I will never forget. I was sitting on the couch knitting when Sarah walked in, her face flushed with anger. She said, Mary, I need the house keys. I looked up confused and said, Why, dear, I'm not going anywhere. She said, Because this is our home now, not yours. I laughed nervously, thinking she must be joking, but her eyes were cold. I said, Sarah, this house is mine. Your name isn't on the deed. She stepped closer, her hand trembling, and said, Give me the keys, Mary, right now. I stood up, feeling the world tilt a little beneath me. I said, Sarah, you're upset. Let's talk. Michael, why? I'll be home soon. We can sort this out. But before I could take another breath, her hand struck across my face. The sound filled the room, and everything went still. My heart stopped for a moment. I touched my cheek, staring at her tears, welling up not from the pain, but from disbelief. She said, You'll regret standing in my way, and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I sank onto the couch, trembling, my heart pounding like a drum. The walls felt smaller that day, the air too thin. I whispered into the empty room, what did I do wrong? I thought about Tom, how he would have held me and said, Mary, don't let this break you. But he wasn't here, just the quiet ticking of the old clock on the wall. When Michael came home, I told him everything. His face went pale. He said, Mom, she didn't mean it. She's just stressed. Please don't make this worse. I looked at him with tears streaming down my face and said, Son, she hit me in my own home. He turned away, unable to meet my eyes that hurt more than the slap itself. That knee. I sat alone in my bedroom, staring out at the moonlight. My heart was heavy, but somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, Don't give up, Mary, you've survived worse storms before. I thought about the years of struggle, the times Tom and I had faced life's harsh winds together. I had always believed in love, forgiveness, and strength. Maybe this was another test, one I had to face on my own. The next morning, I woke up early, made a cup of tea, and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My cheek was still red, but my eyes were steady. I whispered to myself, You will not let bitterness live here. This house holds love, and that love will protect it. I didn't know how, but I was sure of one thing: I wasn't going to let anger define me. That was the day I decided to start writing again. I opened an old notebook and began to tell my story, not to the world, but to myself, because I needed to remember who I was. I needed to find my courage again. I didn't know it yet, but that one painful moment would lead me to a path that would change my life forever. A path of standing tall, finding my voice, and learning that even when the people you love hurt you, you can still choose to rise above it. The morning after that slap, I moved slowly through the house as if I was walking through a dream. I could still feel the sting on my skin, but what hurt most was the silence. Michael didn't speak much. He went off to work early, and Sarah stayed in her room for hours. The air between us had changed. Something sacred had broken. I made breakfast like always: eggs, toast, a little coffee for Michael. I placed his plate on the table and waited, but he didn't come out. Instead, he grabbed a sandwich on his way out the door without looking at me. He said quickly, "Thanks, Mom," and left. I sat down at the table, staring at the 2 empty chairs, and whispered quietly to myself, maybe love isn't enough sometimes. Later that afternoon, Sarah came out dressed neatly, her hair tied back, her face calm as if nothing had happened. She looked at me and said flatly, "We need to talk." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. She said, "Michael and I have decided it's time to make some changes. You're getting older, and this house is too big for you. We think it's better if you move to a retirement place or maybe stay with your sister for a while." I felt my stomach twist and said softly, "This is my home, Sarah. I built this life with my husband. Long before you came." She crossed her arms and said, "Exactly. It's time to pass it on." I didn't argue. I just looked at her, trying to understand what kind of pain turns love into cruelty. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she felt trapped. I wanted to believe there was still goodness in her. I said, "Sarah, I don't want to fight. I just want peace." She looked away and said, "Peace comes when people know their place." Then she walked out, leaving me alone again. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker outside. The neighborhood was quiet. The same one I had lived in for 40 years, I remember. Red summer barbecues, Christmas lights, Tom building that porch with his bare hands. Everything in this house held a story, and now someone was trying to erase it. The next morning, I called my friend Clara. She had been my neighbor for as long as I could remember, a woman with silver hair and the softest heart. She listened quietly as I told her everything. When I finished, she sighed deeply and said, "Mary, you've always been too gentle, but maybe now it's time to stand up for yourself. She's wrong. You don't have to leave your home." I said, "I don't want to fight, Clara. I just want my family back." She said, "Sometimes peace comes after a storm, not before it. Promise me you'll protect yourself." That day, Clara came over with a basket of muffins and a firm look in her eyes. She said, "I called my cousin's lawyer. He'll help you if you ever need it." I told her I can't do that. Not against my own family. But she said, "Just keep the number, Mary, just in case. Sometimes courage is about being ready even when you hope I'll never need to use it." A week passed and things only grew colder. Sarah barely spoke. Michael stayed late at work. I tried everything to make peace, cooking their favorite meals, leaving little notes of kindness. But nothing worked. One evening, I overheard them whispering in the kitchen, Michael's voice low and tired, saying she won't tea. "Agree, Sarah. We can't force her." And Sarah replying, "We'll see about that." It sent a chill through me. That night I cried quietly into my pillow, not because I was weak, but because I was human. I prayed, asking God to give me strength not to hate her. I didn't want to become bitter. I wanted to stay. The woman Tom had loved, gentle and kind, even in the face of cruelty. The next morning, something in me changed. I got dressed, neatly combed my hair, and walked out to the garden. The roses were blooming bright red, just like the ones Tom used to plant. I touched one gently and whispered, "I will not let anyone take this from me. This is still my home, my life, my story. I might be old, but I am not helpless." From that day, I started keeping a small journal. I wrote everything I felt, every fear, every memory. I didn't know it then, But that little notebook would become my strength. It reminded me who I was. It reminded me that even when the world turns cold, you can still keep a warm heart. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah grew more impatient. She wanted control, she wanted ownership, but I stood quietly strong, polite, yet firm. I began to notice how her anger lost its power when I didn't react. She would shout, and I would simply smile and say, "Sarah, I hope one day you find peace." It drove her mad, but it also made her see that kindness can be stronger than fury. One evening, Michael came home early. He found me sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. He sat beside me and said, "Mom, I'm sorry for everything. I don't know how to fix this." I said, "Son, you can't fix what others refuse to see, but you can choose what kind of man you'll be." He looked down and nodded quietly. I could tell he was torn between love and guilt, and I knew I had to let him find his own way. That night I wrote in my journal again. I wrote, "Today I learned that courage isn't loud. It's the quiet decision to keep standing when the world wants you to sit down. It's choosing love over hate, even when your heart is breaking." Little did I know that this was only the beginning, that slap had started a storm. But I was learning how to stand in the rain the next morning, felt heavier than the last. I could sense something in the air, a kind of tension that wrapped itself around the house. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was thick and uneasy. Sarah moved around like she owned the place, checking every corner, rearranging things and making phone calls in whispers. I tried to stay out of her way, but it was my home, and avoiding her felt like walking through shadows in my own house. That afternoon, I was in the kitchen making soup when I heard a knock on the door. I wiped my hands and opened it. It was a man in a gray suit holding a clipboard. He smiled politely and said, "Mrs. Miller, I'm from the real estate office." I froze and said softly, "There must be a mistake." He looked down at his paper and said, "No, ma'am, your daughter-in-law scheduled an appraisal for this property." My heart sank. I called for Sarah, and she came down the stairs with a calm smile as if nothing was wrong. She said, "Oh, I forgot to mention that I'm just having the house valued. It's just paperwork. Mom, don't get so worked up." I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry. "Sarah, this is my home, not yours." She smiled again and said, "For now." That night, I sat by my window again, watching the streetlights blur through tears. I wanted to scream, but instead I whispered to Tom's picture, "I don't know how to fight this, but please give me strength." I felt so small, yet something deep inside me stirred, a quiet voice telling me that I couldn't keep letting her take pieces of my life away. The next morning, I went to see Clara. She took one look at my face and said, "Mary, what happened?" Now I told her everything, and she said firmly, "That's it. You're calling the lawyer." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp with anger. I hesitated, but then nodded quietly. Maybe it was time. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. He was kind. A middle-aged man named Mr. Bennett who listened without interrupting when I finished. He said, "Mrs. Miller, legally, if the house is in your name, no one can force you out. You have every right to stay." I felt tears rise in my eyes, but this time they were not from sadness. They were from relief. He gave me some papers to sign, just to protect my rights, and said sometimes doing the right thing means setting boundaries even with family. When I got home, Sarah was waiting. She must have noticed I'd gone out. She asked sharply, "Where were you?" I said calmly, "Out for some air." She frowned and said, "You're being secretive now." I just smiled gently and said, "Everyone deserves a little space." She didn't like that answer and stormed off, but for the first time, I felt something strong inside me again. I felt my spine straighten a little. I felt the power of quiet courage. A few days later, Michael came home early. He looked tired, older, somehow. He sat at the table and said, "Mom, I don't know what's happening anymore. Sarah says you're trying to take the house from us." I told him softly, "Son, this house was never yours to take. It was always meant to be our family's home, but not through control or anger." He rubbed his face and said, "I just want peace." I said, "I do too. But peace built on fear isn't peace at all." That night I prayed longer than usual. I asked for wisdom, for patience, for grace. I wanted to find strength without bitterness. I wanted to understand Sarah, even when she seemed impossible. The truth was, I could see her pain behind the anger. Maybe she was scared of losing control. Maybe she felt invisible. I tried to remind myself that sometimes people hurt others because they are hurting themselves. The next morning, I made breakfast again, and this time, when Sarah came down, I greeted her kindly, "Good morning, Sarah. I made your favorite pancakes." She looked surprised for a moment, then said, "I'm not hungry." I smiled and said, "That's all right. Maybe later." She turned away quickly, but I saw something flicker in her eyes, a small crack in her anger. Days passed, and I stayed steady, polite, quiet, strong. Sarah's frustration grew. She wanted a reaction, but I refused to give her hate. She began talking about moving out with Michael. If things didn't change, I could see that her control was slipping, and it scared her more than she wanted to admit. One evening, I was sitting on the porch again. When Clara joined me with 2 cups of tea, she said softly, "You're doing well, Mary. You're standing tall, but still kind." "That's rare," I said. "I don't feel brave, Clara. I just don't want to become like her." She smiled gently and said, "That's exactly what makes you brave." That night, I wrote in my journal again. I wrote, "Today I realized courage is not loud. It's the quiet voice that's I will not let bitterness win. I will not lose myself, no matter what they do." The next morning, Sarah walked in with a suitcase. I looked at her quietly. She said coldly, "Michael and I are staying with friends for a few days." I nodded and said, "Take care of yourself." She looked at me, confused, maybe expecting me to beg her to stay, but I just smiled. When the door closed behind them, I exhaled deeply and felt something shift. The house was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was peaceful. It was mine again. I walked through every room, touching the furniture, the walls, the photographs, every scratch, every faded spot, held a memory. I whispered softly, "Thank you, God, for giving me another chance to start over." I thought the story was ending, but deep down I knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where courage would no longer whisper but shine quietly from within. A week passed after Sarah and Michael left the house. Felt different now, quieter, but not empty. It was as if the walls were breathing again the way they used to. When laughter filled the rooms, I woke up early every morning, opened the windows, and let the sun pour in. I cooked breakfast for myself, brewed coffee, and even played the old radio that had been silent for months. I could hear birds singing outside, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel afraid. Every evening, Clara came by with her tea and her stories. We would sit on the porch and talk about simple things, gardens, grandkids, the weather. She kept saying, "Mary, you look lighter now." I smiled because she was right. I felt free. My heart still ached, but it was a softer ache, the kind that reminds you you're still alive. But peace in life never stays untouched. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry, I heard a car pull up. I looked through the window and saw Michael's truck. My heart fluttered between joy and worry. He got out slowly, but Sarah didn't follow. I stepped outside and said quietly, "Michael, are you all right?" He nodded, but his face was tired. He said, "Mo, I need to talk." I knew that tone. It was the sound of trouble trying to come back into the door you just closed. We sat on the porch. He looked down at his hands for a long moment before speaking. "Mom, things aren't good between us. Sarah's been angry. She says she feels disrespected. She says you turned me against her." I told him softly, "Michael, I never wanted to turn anyone against anyone. I just want peace in this home." He sighed and said, "I know, but she doesn't see it that way. She wants to come back." My stomach tightened. I wanted to say no, but I couldn't be cruel. I asked, "Does she want to talk to me?" He nodded and said, "She's waiting in the car." I stood up slowly and looked toward the road. There she was, sitting in the passenger seat, her face hard, her eyes cold. But there was something else there too, maybe exhaustion, maybe shame. I walked down the steps and went to her window. She rolled it down slowly. I said softly, "Sarah, how are you?" She looked away and said, "I just came to get some things." She didn't look at me once. I said, "All right, come in, take what you need." She hesitated, but finally stepped out and walked inside. She moved through the house, fast grabbing clothes, shoes. A few boxes I followed quietly, not to watch her, but to make sure she didn't take anything that wasn't hers. When she reached the living room, she stopped in front of Tom's photo and stared for a moment. I said gently, "He loved you." "You know," she turned to me, her eyes sharp, and said, "Don't pretend you're the saint here, Mary. You've always tried to control everything." I said, "Softly, Sarah. This house has love, not control. You just never wanted to feel part of it." She glared at me, but I didn't flinch. She left without saying goodbye. But before walking out, she turned and said, "This isn't over, Mary, you'll see." When the door shut, I sank into the couch, my hands trembling. I wasn't scared. I was just tired of fighting battles I never started. I closed my eyes and whispered, "God, I can't change her heart, but please protect mine." That evening, I called Clara again. She listened and said, "Mary, people like Sarah, they fight shadows of their own pain. You can't heal her, but you can keep shining your light." I said quietly, "I don't want to hate her, Clara. I just want her to stop hurting everyone," she said. "Then keep doing what you're doing. Kindness will confuse her anger." Days passed quietly. After that, I started volunteering at the local community center, helping women who had lost their spouses like me. I met so many brave souls, each with their own story of struggle and strength. It filled my heart again. Every time I helped someone, I felt Tom's spirit smiling somewhere near me. One day, while helping at the center, I saw a familiar face. It was Sarah. She looked thinner, her eyes swollen from crying. She saw me, froze, and whispered, "Oh, no," I said softly. "Hello, Sarah." She looked down and said, "I didn't know you worked here." I said, "I don't work here. I just come to help people heal." She hesitated for a long moment, then said quietly, "I came for counseling. I do. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't sleep. I can't think. I keep hurting the people I love. And I don't even know why." I felt a lump in my throat, but I stayed calm. I said, "You don't have to know right now. Healing starts when you stop running." She looked at me, tears filling her eyes, and said, "You should hate me after everything I did." I said, "Hate only makes the wound deeper, Sarah. Maybe it's time we both choose peace." She started crying then, real tears, not angry ones, and I put my hand gently on her shoulder. For the first time in a long time, I saw not my enemy, but a young woman who had lost her way. We talked for a long time that day, not as rivals, not as in-laws, but as two women broken by life trying to find their way back to grace. When I got home that night, I sat on the porch again. The sunset was painting the sky gold and pink. I whispered softly, "Thank you, God, for this moment, for showing me that even hearts that have hurt us can still heal." That night in my journal I wrote today, I learned that forgiveness is not about forgetting. It is about freeing yourself from the weight of pain. It is about seeing the same world through softer eyes and realizing that even those who hurt you are still capable of change. The next few weeks move like gentle waves, calm and quiet. I still went to the community center every other day, helping women fill out forms, listening to their stories, holding their hands when words failed. Some days I saw Sarah there, sitting alone in the corner during group sessions. Her face looked different now, softer somehow. The anger that once burned in her eyes had dimmed, leaving behind something fragile. At first, she didn't talk to me much. She would just nod politely from a distance. I respected that. I knew healing took time, and silence could be its own kind of courage. One afternoon after the session ended, she walked up to me slowly. She said, "Mary, can we talk outside?" I nodded and followed her out to the little garden behind the center. The air smelled like rain and the benches were damp from an earlier shower. She sat down and looked at her hands. She said quietly, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I've done terrible things." I said softly, "Sarah, I already have." She looked up surprised. I said, "I forgave you the day you walked out of the house. Forgiveness isn't for you, it's for me. I needed peace and holding anger was too heavy." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she whispered. "I keep ruining everything I love." I said, "Maybe you've been hurt more than you let anyone see. Sometimes pain turns into pride before we even know it. She started crying, really crying, her shoulders shaking. I didn't move. I just let her cry beside me. I didn't need to fix her, just to be there. When she finally calmed down, she said, "I don't deserve kindness." And I said, "Maybe not yet, but everyone deserves a chance to find it again." That evening, when I went home, the house felt different. The same walls that once held tension now held quiet peace. I made myself tea and sat on the porch, the sky deep blue and filled with stars. I whispered softly, "Thank you, Lord, for teaching me that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a soft yes when your heart wants to say no." The next day, Sarah called me for the first time on her own. She said, "Mary, I talked to Michael. He wants us to try again." She paused and added, "I want to do it right this time. If you'll let me," I said softly. "You don't need my permission, Sarah, but if you mean what you say, I'll support you." She said, "I do, I really do." A week later, Michael brought her over. They both looked nervous, like children returning home after running away. I welcomed them in with a gentle smile. I had baked a small pie the way I used to when life was simpler. Sarah looked at it and said softly, "You remembered my favorite." I nodded and said, "Of course some things don't change." She smiled faintly, and for the first time in years there was no bitterness in her eyes. We sat together and talked quietly. Michael kept glancing at Sarah as if trying to make sure she wouldn't break again. But she didn't. She spoke honestly. She apologized not with fancy words, but with tears and sincerity. She said, "I thought control was strength, but now I see that love is the real strength. I let pride guide me, and it destroyed everything. I'm sorry for hurting you, Mary, for disrespecting your home, your love, your son." I took her hands and said, "Sarah, you've come far, and I'm proud of you." That night after they left, I wrote again in my journal. I wrote, "Today I saw a miracle, not the kind that parts seas or moves mountains, but the kind that softens hearts. Forgiveness is not weakness. It's the strongest act of love a soul can give." Weeks turned into months, and our lives slowly stitched themselves back together like torn fabric mended by gentle hands. Sarah and I began cooking together, sometimes laughing awkwardly over burned pancakes or spilling flour all over the counter. We still had our differences. But the war had ended and peace was taking root. Michael say, "I'm lighter too." I could see the relief in his eyes. He would hug me before leaving for work and say, "Thanks, Mom, for not giving up on us." And I would smile and say, "That's what family is for." One evening we had dinner together, all three of us. The table was full of food and warmth. Sarah reached out halfway through and said softly, "Mary, I want you to know I've been seeing a counselor. I'm learning about my temper, about my past, about why I act the way I do. I want to be better." I squeezed her hand and said, "You already are. You're trying, and that's what matters." After dinner, she helped me clean the dishes, and when we were done, she looked around the kitchen and said, "I used to see this house as something to take over. Now I see it as a home, a gift you built with love." I smiled and said, "That's what it was always meant to be." That night, as I lay in bed, I felt peace like a blanket around my heart. I thought of Tom and whispered quietly, "We made it through another storm, my love. And somehow the sun is shining again." I drifted to sleep with a smile because I knew that even though scars remain, they remind us not of the pain, but of the healing that followed the next morning when I woke up. I wrote in my journal again today. I learned that bravery is not about fighting others. It's about loving them enough to stay kind even when they don't deserve it. The summer air grew heavier that year. The kind of warmth that made everything slow and quiet. The garden was in full bloom, the roses taller than they had been in years. I would spend my mornings watering them and thinking how much life can change in just one season. Sometimes I would see Sarah sitting on the porch, sipping coffee in silence. It felt peaceful now, like two rivers finally flowing side by side instead of against each other. Michael was working extra hours at the construction site. He often came home late, tired, but smiling. He seemed proud of how things had changed between us. He would say, "Mom, I feel like the house is alive again," and I would smile. Because he was right. It was alive with forgiveness and calm. But life has a way of testing the peace we build just to see how strong it really is. One night the phone rang while I was preparing dinner. Sarah answered, and her face turned pale. She said softly, "Oh my God," and then her voice broke. I walked over and asked what happened. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. Michael had been in an accident. The next few hours were a blur. We rushed to the hospital, hearts racing, minds praying, the smell of antiseptic, the cold air, the echo of footsteps. Everything felt unreal when the doctor came out. I could barely breathe. He said Michael is stable, but he has a fractured leg and a concussion. He'll need surgery, but he'll recover. Sarah collapsed into the chair. Sobbing, I wrapped my arms around her, holding her like a child. She whispered, "It's my fault we argued this morning. I told him to leave angry. I said things I didn't mean." I rubbed her back and said softly, "No, Sarah. Life doesn't punish us. It just are. It minds us to love harder." She cried harder, and for the first time I saw how deep her love for him really ran. We stayed at the hospital for days, taking turns by his bedside. Sarah wouldn't leave. Even for a minute she held his hand, whispering prayers into the air. I saw her exhaustion, but also her devotion. She had changed. I could see it in the way she looked at him, in the way she spoke softly to the nurses, always thanking them, always patient, even in fear. After the surgery, Michael began to recover slowly. He was weak but alive, and that was enough for us when we finally brought him home. The house felt like a sanctuary again. I set up a small bed for him in the living room so we could watch over him easily. Sarah took care of him day and night, barely sleeping. She cooked, cleaned, helped him with everything. And every time she passed by me, she would smile, a tired but grateful smile. One evening after Michael had fallen asleep, I found Sarah sitting outside on the porch, staring at the stars. She looked lost in thought. I brought her a blanket and sat beside her. She said quietly, "Mary, I don't think I ever understood what family really meant until now. It's not about control or pride. It's about showing up when it's hard." I said softly, "You've learned what most people never do, that love is not about winning, it's about staying." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and whispered, "I almost lost everything, and you still stood by me." Why? I smiled gently and said, "Because someone once did the same for me." For a while we sat in silence, just listening to the crickets and the soft breeze passing through the trees. Then Sarah said, "Thank you, Mary, for not giving up on me." I looked at her and said, "I didn't do anything special. I just loved you when you didn't know how to love yourself." Days turned into weeks, and Michael's strength slowly returned. He began walking with a cane, and soon he was smiling again, the house filled with laughter. Small but genuine laughter that felt like music. One afternoon he hugged us both and said, "I don't know how I got so lucky to have two strong women taking care of me." Sarah smiled and said, "I guess life gave me a second chance and I don't plan to waste it." That night as I lay in bed, I thought of how strange life can be, how it takes breaking to make us whole again. I thought of Sarah's journey from anger to healing, from hate to love, and I realized that courage doesn't always look like standing tall. Sometimes it looks like kneeling beside someone in pain and choosing not to walk away. The next morning, I opened my journal and wrote, "Today I learned that love is not a feeling, it's a decision you make every day, even when your heart is tired, especially then." The garden outside the window looked brighter that morning. The roses swayed gently in the wind, and I could almost hear Tom's voice whispering, "You did good, Mary? You kept the family together?" I smiled softly and said, "I just followed love." That weekend, we all sat outside for breakfast. The sun was shining the coffee. SML strong, and Sarah laughed about something. Michael said, I watched them both, their faces full of life, and I felt peace deep inside me. I had spent so many nights praying for this moment, and now that it was here, it felt like grace. But somewhere deep in my heart, I knew life wasn't done teaching us yet. Sometimes the calm before the next storm is the most beautiful part, and I could feel another chapter quietly waiting just beyond the horizon. Autumn came softly that year. The leaves turned gold and orange, painting the streets with memories I loved watching them fall. As I sat on the porch wrapped in my old blue shawl, the air was crisp but kind. like a reminder that even endings can be beautiful. Michael was walking better now, and Sarah seemed calmer, more grounded. We had finally found a rhythm, one built not on fear, but on patience and love. Every Sunday we went to church together, something we hadn't done in years. The pastor often spoke about grace and how forgiveness can turn enemies into fam. I would glance at Sarah during those moments and see her quietly wiping away a tear she was trying, really trying, and that made my heart swell with hope. One evening, we were all having dinner. The light from the candles flickered across the room, making everything glow warm and gentle. Sarah laughed at something Michael said, her laughter soft and full of life. It was a sound I had never heard from her before, free of bitterness. I thought to myself, maybe this is what peace really feels like. But life has a way of changing in a heartbeat. A week later, I woke up early to the sound of the phone ringing. It was still dark outside. I answered and heard a woman's voice from the hospital. She said, "Mrs. Miller, I'm sorry, but your friend Clara has passed away in her sleep." I felt my knees go weak. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. I couldn't breathe for a moment. The room spun around me. Clara, my dearest friend, the one who stood by me through every storm, who reminded me of my strength when I forgot it. She was gone, just like that. The next few days moved in slow motion. I went to her funeral, holding a small white rose. Sarah and Michael came with me. Sarah held my arm the entire time, silent but steady. Standing there by Clara's grave, I felt an ache I hadn't felt in years, the ache of losing someone who knew your heart better than you did yourself. The priest spoke softly about kindness and legacy, and I could only think about all the mornings Clara and I had shared tea, laughter and tears. She had been my anchor when the waves of life grew too strong. That night back home, I sat by the window alone. The stars were faint, and the world felt too quiet. I whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Clara, for teaching me how to be brave. I hope I made you proud." I cried until my chest hurt, but they were not hopeless tears. They were tears of love and gratitude, because I realized that even in loss, we find reminders of how deeply we've lived. Sarah knocked on my door later. She came in quietly, sat beside me, and held my hand. She didn't speak, just sat there. Her silence said more than words ever could. I turned to her and said softly, "Sarah, when you lose people, you love. It teaches you what really matters." She nodded and whispered, "I'm sorry for your pain, Mary." I said, "Thank you, dear, but pain is also a teacher." In the days that followed, Sarah began helping me more around the house. She cooked. Meals brought me tea, sat with me on the porch, sometimes not saying a word, just keeping me company. The woman who once shouted and demanded now moved through my home with gentleness. One afternoon, she brought out an old box from the attic. She said, "I found this while cleaning." It was filled with old letters, pictures, and small trinkets from the years Tom and I had built this home. I smiled through tears. She said softly, "You and Tom had something special, didn't you?" I nodded and said, "Yes, we did. But what made it special wasn't that it was perfect. It was that we never gave up on each other." She looked at me quietly and said, "That's what I want for Michael and me." And I said, "Then fight for it, but fight with love, not anger." That night, I wrote again in my journal. I wrote, "Today I lost my oldest friend, but gained a deeper understanding of love. Maybe death is not the end. Maybe it's just another way for the soul to rest while love keeps living in us." The next morning, I felt lighter. Somehow the grief was still there, but softer, like a shadow that follows you quietly but no longer hurts. Sarah joined me for breakfast and asked, "Would you like to go to the community center again today, Mary?" I smiled and said yes. Clara would want that, so we went. We spent the day helping others, handing out food, listening to stories of people struggling with loss. When we returned home that evening, Sarah said quietly, "You were right, helping others heals you too." I said, "Yes, dear, it always does." As the sun set that night, the sky turned a deep shade of gold. I stood at the window and whispered, "Thank you, God, for every goodbye that teaches us to love be." to every pain that makes us gentler, and every day that gives us another chance to begin again. The wind carried the scent of roses through the air, and I closed my eyes, knowing Clara's spirit was somewhere near, smiling proud that I had chosen love over sorrow. The months passed, and the air turned colder. The mornings came with fog rolling across the yard, and I could hear the soft crunch of leaves beneath my slippers when I stepped outside. The garden was fading now, the roses curling into sleep for the winter. But I still watered them out of habit because it made me feel alive. Sarah had become like a daughter to me. We cooked together. We laughed, sometimes even teased each other. She helped me with the groceries, and every Sunday she drove me to church. I never thought we would come this far from where we started. Sometimes I would watch her helping Michael fix things around the house, and my heart would swell with pride. She had grown into the kind of woman I always knew she could be, one chilly afternoon. I was sitting by the window reading when I heard the sound of a car pulling up. I looked outside and froze. An old blue truck had parked by the curb. A man stepped out, tall, gray-haired, with kind eyes. I knew that face. Even after so many years, my heart skipped. He was Henry, Tom's younger brother, the one who moved away decades ago after a falling out we never fully mended. I opened the door slowly and said softly, "Henry." He smiled a little uncertainly and said, "Hello, Mary. It's been a long time." I nodded, not trusting my voice for a moment. Then I said, "Come in, please come." The years melted away for a moment, and I saw him as the young man who used to help Tom fix fences and tell jokes during family picnics. He stepped inside, looking around quietly at the house. Every corner was still familiar to him. He said softly, "Looks the same, Mary, except maybe a little quieter." I smiled and said, "Life does that to us sometimes." Sarah came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands. She looked surprised. "But Paul." "Hello," she said. "I'm Sarah." Henry smiled gently and said, "You must be Michael's wife. I've heard about you." He turned to me again and said, "I hope this isn't a bad time. I was passing through town, and I wanted to see you." We sat down in the living room. I made coffee the way I always did. And for a while we talked about old times, about Tom, about the days when family gatherings were loud and full of laughter. But beneath it all, there was something heavy between us, unspoken years, unsent letters. Finally, Henry sighed and said, "Mary, I came because I need to make peace with the past. Tom and I fought over foolish things, and I let pride keep us apart. When I heard he passed, I couldn't forgive myself. I should have come sooner." Tears welled in my eyes, but I smiled through them. I said, "Henry, Tom loved you. He talked about you. Even near the end, he wanted to fix things too." Henry's eyes softened and he whispered, "I wish I had known." Sarah sat quietly watching us. She could feel the emotion in the room. Henry looked Ed around and said softly, "You've kept everything so warm, Mary. I can see why Tom loved this home so much." I nodded and said, "This house has seen storms, but it still stands. That's what love does. It keeps standing even when it breaks a little." After Henry left that evening, the house felt different. Quieter but peaceful. Sarah came and sat beside me on the couch. She said, "You know, Mary, I used to think family was just about blood, but it's really about forgiveness, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, dear, forgiveness is what keeps the roots alive, even when the branches break." She smiled gently and said, "You're the strongest person I've ever known." I said, "No, Sarah, I just learned to bend without breaking." The next few days, Henry visited often. Sometimes we sat on the porch just talking about the past. Other times, he helped Michael fix the old barn that had started to lean. Sarah would bring us lemonade and smile shyly. Henry told stories about his travels, about the people he met, about how he wished he had called sooner. EA. Story felt like a stitch closing an old wound. One evening, as the sun went down and the air turned golden, he looked at me and said quietly, "Mary, I'm proud of you. You kept this family's heart alive, even after all the pain. You kept the kindness Tom always talked about." I smiled and said I just did what love asked of me. That night I wrote in my journal again. I wrote, "Today I learned that time can heal things, even when you think it's too late. Sometimes it takes decades for the truth to find its way back home, but when it does, it brings peace with it." Later that night, Sarah knocked softly on my door. She said, "Mary, can I tell you something?" I said, "Of course, dear." She hesitated, then said, "I found out something a few days ago, and I wasn't sure how to tell you I'm pregnant." My heart leaped. I stood up and hugged her. She cried in my arms, saying, "I was scared to tell you after everything we've been through, but I wanted you to be the first to know." I held her close and whispered, "Oh, Sarah, what a blessing." W. Had a beautiful new beginning. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop smiling. The house that had once been full of pain and shouting was now full of laughter and new life. I thought of Tom, of Clara, of every loss and every scar, and I realized they had all led us to this moment. The next morning, I wrote in my journal one last line for the day I wrote today. I learned that life always finds a way to bloom again, even after the hardest winters. The winter came softly that year. The first snow fell on a Sunday morning, and the world outside turned still and white. The trees bowed under the weight of it, and I stood by the window watching the flakes drift down slow like feathers falling from heaven. Sarah was resting on the couch, her hands on her growing belly and a gentle smile on her face. Michael sat beside her reading something on his phone, but every few minutes he would glance at her as if making sure she was comfortable. I could see the love between them now, clear and strong. It filled the whole. Used like sunlight on a cold day. I brought them both hot cocoa and said softly, "You two remind me of when Tom and I were expecting Michael. Those were happy days, though full of worry too." Sarah laughed a little and said, "I worry all the time, Mary. What if I'm not ready? What if I make mistakes?" I smiled and said, "Oh dear, you will make mistakes. That's what mothers do. But love will teach you how to get up every time." As the weeks passed, Sarah's belly grew, and so did her kindness. She spoke gently now. Even when tired, she helped with dinner. She listened when I told stories about the past. She often asked questions about Tom, and I would tell her how we built this home board by board, dream by dream. Sometimes she would rest her head on my shoulder and say, "I hope our baby grows up in a home filled with that kind of love." One night while I was knitting by the fire, Sarah suddenly gasped and clutched her stomach. Michael jumped up. "Mary," she said breathlessly, "I think it's time." My heart raced. I ran to grab her coat. Michael got the car ready. The roads were covered with snow, but he drove carefully. The hospital lights glowed in the distance like a promise. Hours passed. The waiting room was quiet, except for the sound of the clock ticking. I prayed quietly for her and for the baby. I whispered, "Please, God, keep them safe. Bring them both through this with love and strength." Just as dawn began to break, the nurse came out with a smile. She said softly, "Congratulations, Grandma, you have a granddaughter." My heart swelled. I felt the tears rush to my eyes. "A granddaughter," I whispered. "Thank you, God, thank you." When I walked into the room, Sarah looked exhausted but radiant. She was holding a tiny bundle wrapped in pink. Her eyes met mine, and she said softly, "Mary, meet your granddaughter, Emily." I stepped closer, trembling with joy. I looked down at that little face, her eyes still closed, her lips soft and new, and I thought, this is what miracles look like. I touched her tiny hand and whispered, "Welcome to the world, little O." "Nah, you have no idea how many prayers carried you here." Sarah smiled and said, "I'm so happy you're here with me, Mary. I couldn't have done this without you." I said, "You did it all, dear. I just kept the light on for you." The first days home were full of soft cries, lullabies, and the smell of baby powder. The house felt alive again. Emily's tiny socks hung on the line by the window sunlight, touching them like blessings. Michael and Sarah took turns waking up at night. I would hear them whispering in the dark, laughing quietly, even in their exhaustion. One evening when Sarah was feeding Emily, she looked at me with teary eyes and said, "Mary, I never told you this, but when I first came into this house, I thought you were my enemy. I thought you were standing in the way of my life, but now I know you were trying to protect me from myself," I said softly. "We all have storms inside us, dear. Some people run from them, some face them, and some learn to dance in the rain. You chose to face yours, and that's why you're her. Now, with this little angel in your arms." She smiled through her tears and said, "You're my mother now more than anyone else ever was." I reached over and touched her cheek and said, "And you're my daughter now." As the weeks turned into months, spring arrived again. The garden began to bloom. The roses came back brighter than ever. I spent my mornings there with Emily in my arms, singing the same lullabies I once sang to Michael. The neighbors would stop by sometimes, bringing cookies or flowers. Everyone wanted to meet the new little blessing. One afternoon, Henry stopped by too. He brought a wooden rocking chair he had built himself. He said softly, "For the new grandma and her grandbaby." I smiled so wide I thought my heart would burst. I placed it by the window where the sun always came in, and every day after that I rocked Emily to sleep there, her tiny hand wrapped around my finger, her breathing soft and peaceful. Sometimes when the house was quiet, I would whisper to her, "Emily, my little hope, remember tea? You come from women who learned how to stand. Even when the ground trembled beneath them, you come from love and courage and kindness, and that is the greatest gift you will ever have." One night, as the stars glittered outside and the house was still, I sat by the window with Emily sleeping in my arms. I thought of Clara, of Tom, of all the years that had shaped me, the pain, the joy, the lessons I had learned through every storm, and I whispered softly, "Thank you, God, for not letting me give up when it was hard, because if I had, I would have missed this moment." Life had come full circle again, and I knew deep in my heart that love had won after all the days began to blend into soft golden evenings. The baby's laughter echoed through the house like music, and every corner that once held silence now held warmth and life. I would sit by the window most mornings with Emily in my lap, watching the sunlight spill across the floor. Her little hands would reach for the light, and I would smile thinking she was already chasing dreams even before she could walk. Sarah was glowing with new strength. She was patient, gentle, and loving. The woman who once demanded and shouted had become someone kind, someone brave. She reminded me of myself when I was younger, full of fire, but learning slowly how to use that fire to warm, not to burn. Sometimes when I watched her with Emily, I thought about how love can truly change people from the inside out. Michael worked hard still, but he came home early now. He wanted to be there for every bedtime, every small giggle, every moment of family life that he once missed. He often looked at Sarah with gratitude, as if silently thanking her for fighting through the dark days. I knew deep inside that they had both found healing through each other. One afternoon, the doctor called me in for a regular checkup. He smiled gently after the tests and said, "Mary, you are healthy for your age, but we must keep an eye on your heart." I nodded quietly. I knew my body was slowing down. I could feel it sometimes in my steps, in the way my breath came shorter after a walk. But I didn't feel fear, only peace. I had lived enough to know that every day was a gift. When I came home, Sarah noticed I looked tired. She said, "Mary, are you all right?" I smiled and said, "Just the usual checkup, dear." "I'm fine." She looked unconvinced but didn't press further. Later that evening, she made soup and insisted I rest. She sat by my bed reading softly while Emily slept in her crib beside us. The sound of her voice was soothing, like music from a past life. Days passed into months. Emily started crawling, then walking. Her first word was "Mama," and Sarah cried when she heard it. I laughed and said, "Don't worry, dear. Soon she will be calling everyone Mama." She called me Nana, which melted my heart. I would sit with her on the porch and tell her stories about when her grandpa Tom was young, how he planted the first tree in the yard and said, "One day this tree will see generations grow under its shade." Sometimes I would dream about too. M2. In those dreams, he would stand by the porch smiling the same way he always did, calm. Strong, his voice would echo in my mind telling me, "You did well, Mary. You kept the home full of love." I would wake up with tears, but they were peaceful ones. One morning, while I was watering the garden, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. I sat down on the bench and breathed slowly. The air smelled of roses, the same kind Tom had planted. I looked around and thought how beautiful life had been. Sarah came running out a moment later. "Mary, are you okay?" I nodded weakly and said, "Just a little tired." "Dear." She helped me inside and made me rest. At night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, the soft hum of the heater, the distant sound of Emily's giggle as Sarah played with her. I realized how time had moved so gently, like a river carrying us all forward without stopping. I whispered a small prayer. Thank you for letting me see love reborn in this home. The next few days, I slowed down even more. Sarah refused to let me lift a finger. She made sure I had everything I needed. She would sit beside me in the evenings and we would talk about the future, about Emily's school, about maybe planting a new tree in the backyard. She said, Mary, I want Emily to always grow up, knowing your strength. I smiled and said, then tell her my story. Tell her how love forgives, how kindness heals, how patience rebuilds everything. One evening, while the sunset painted the sky in orange and pink, Sarah and Michael came to me. They said, Mary, we've been thinking it's time you stopped worrying about the house. We want you to rest. We'll take care of everything now. I smiled and said, I know, dear, this house belongs to love, not to me anymore. That night, after they went to bed, I sat in the rocking chair with Emily in my arms. She was half asleep. Her little breath warm against my chest, I whispered softly, you will grow up strong, little one, kind and brave like your mother. I may not be here forever, but my love will be, you will feel it. In the walls of this home, in the wind that moves through the garden, in every sunset that touches your face. I placed her gently in her crib, kissed her forehead, and whispered, good night, my heart, good night. As I turned off the light, I looked around the house and felt a deep peace. It was quiet but full of love, the kind of peace that comes only after long storms. I knew Tom would be proud. I knew Clara would be smiling somewhere. I knew my time was nearing, but I wasn't afraid. I went to my room and opened my journal. For the last time I wrote today, I learned that love never truly ends. It only changes hands. It lives on in the people we teach and the hearts we touch. I am grateful for every tear, every laughter, every sunrise that led me here. Then I closed the book, placed it on my nightstand, and looked out the window at the moon hanging high and bright. I whispered softly, thank you, God, for giving me a life worth remembering and for letting me leave it full of love. The next morning, the sun rose like it always did, painting the sky gold and quiet. Sarah came to check on me with Emily in her arms. She knocked softly on my door and said, Mary, time for breakfast, but I didn't answer. She opened the door slowly, the light spilling into the room. She saw me lying peacefully, the journal still beside my hand, the softest smile on my face. My time had come quietly, just as I had lived gently and full of love. Sarah stood there frozen, her heart breaking. She walked closer, placed Emily down on the bed beside me, and whispered through tears, Mary, you kept your promise. You filled this house with love. Emily reached out, her tiny hand touching mine, and though I was gone, the room felt warm, as if my spirit had not really left. The days that followed were slow and full of memories. The whole town came to say goodbye. People brought flowers, stories, and tears. Everyone spoke about how I had helped them in small ways, a meal when they were hungry, a word of comfort when they were lost. Sarah stood by my side through it. LL trying to stay strong, but I knew her heart was heavy. When the pastor spoke at my funeral, he said Mary Miller believed in love that forgives and kindness that heals. She lived through storms, but never let the storms live in her heart. She left behind not only a home, but a legacy of peace and courage. After everyone left, Sarah stayed behind at the grave. With Emily in her arms, she whispered through her tears, thank you, Mary, for saving me when I didn't know how to save myself. Thank you for teaching me to love even when it hurts. She placed a small rose on my grave, one from the garden I loved the most, and said softly, rest now, we'll take it from here. Years passed, seasons changed. The house remained the same, warm, full of laughter. The roses still bloomed every spring, and the rocking chair by the window never lost its gentle creak. Emily grew fast. She had her father's eyes and her mother's smile, and when she laughed, it filled the house with light. One evening, when she was about 6 years old, she found my old journal on the shelf. She brought it to Sarah and said, Mommy, what's this? Sarah held it in her hands and smiled through her tears. She said that was Mary's. She wrote about love and courage and life. Emily said softly, "Can you read it to me?" So Sarah began to read the words. I had written every line filled with warmth and truth. As she read, Emily listened with wide eyes. She said, "Mommy, did she really love us that much?" Sarah hugged her and said, "More than you can ever imagine. She taught me everything I know about love and kindness." Emily smiled and said, "I want to be like her when I grow up." From that day forward, Sarah made sure that every part of my story lived in Emily. She told her about the garden, about Tom, about the time when love healed their home. She showed her how to bake my favorite pie and how to care for roses. She even kept my blue shawl and would wrap it around her shoulders when the nights were cold, saying it made her feel like I was still there. As the years went on, Emily became a bright young woman full of compassion. She volunteered at the same community center where Sarah and I once helped others. She had that same spark that never gave up, the same gentle heart that forgave easily. One day she came home after helping an old neighbor and said softly, "Mommy, I think I understand now. Love doesn't end, does it?" Sarah smiled with tears in her eyes and said, "No, dear, it doesn't. It just changes hands." Time moved like a gentle breeze. Sarah grew older. Michael's hair turned gray, and Emily grew into a beautiful woman. She often sat by the garden reading my old letters, sometimes speaking softly as if to me she would say, "Nana, I hope you can see us. We are happy we are living the way you taught us to." And I was there in every breeze that touched her hair, in every rose that bloomed in the morning light, in every sound of laughter that echoed through the home I had once built with my hands. One summer evening, when the sky was full of pink clouds, Sarah sat in the rocking chair. With Emily beside her, they watched the sun setting over the yard, and Sarah said softly, "You know, Emily, I used to be lost. I used to think love was something that had to be perfect, but Mary showed me it only has to be real." Emily smiled and said, "I wish I had met her." Sarah looked at her and said, "You do meet her every day, dear. She's in everything good that we do." The wind carried the scent of roses through the open window, the same scent that once drifted through my days. And as the stars began to appear, Emily whispered into the twilight, "Thank you, Nana, for teaching us that love never dies. It just grows roots in every heart it touches." And in that moment, even though my chair was empty, my garden still bloomed, because love had done what it always does. It lived on, quietly, beautifully, endlessly. Years passed like the turning of quiet pages. The house that once echoed with the cries of a baby now hummed with laughter and stories. Emily had grown into a graceful woman, her spirit bright and kind like sun. Light through the trees, she carried in her heart all the lessons that had been passed down through love, through loss, through time. Sarah's hair had turned silver now. She moved a little slower, but her smile was still gentle, the same smile that Mary once called her miracle. Every morning she sat by the window, wrapped in Mary's blue shawl, watching the roses sway in the wind. The garden was still alive, still blooming, just as Mary had hoped. Emily would visit every weekend, bringing fresh bread from the bakery and stories from the town. She had become a teacher, known for her patience and warmth. The children adored her. She often told them small lessons wrapped in stories about a woman named Mary. Though she never used the word grandmother, she would say, "I once knew someone who believed that love is the strongest thing we can grow." One autumn evening, Emily arrived with her husband and their little boy, a cheerful child with bright eyes. She carried a small box in her hands. Sarah sat in the rocking chair, smiling, saying, "Come here, sweetheart, what have you got there?" Emily knelt beside her and opened the box. Inside was Mary's old journal, the pages worn but still smelling faintly of lavender. She said softly, "Mom, I think it's time he hears her words too." She lifted the little boy onto her lap and began to read from the first page. Her voice trembled slightly as she read about courage and forgiveness, about storms, and patience, about finding light in the darkest days. The boy listened quietly, his eyes wide. When she finished, he said, "Grandma, Mary sounds like an angel." Sarah smiled through her tears and said, "Maybe she was, dear. Maybe she still is." That night after dinner, Emily went out to the garden. The moonlight touched the roses, turning them silver in the dark. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of the flowers, remembering the stories, the laughter, the love she whispered into the cool night air. Nana, I kept my promise. I built a life on kindness, just like you taught me. A soft wind passed through the roses, their petals brushing together like a whisper, and for a moment Emily could almost hear a familiar voice say softly, I know, dear, I never left. I just became the light that guides you. When she went back inside, she found Sarah asleep in the rocking chair, the shawl around her shoulders, the journal resting on her lap. Emily took the shawl gently and wrapped it tighter around. Her mother kissed her forehead and whispered, Rest well, Mom Mary would be proud of you. Years later, the little boy grew older. He would run through the same garden, chasing butterflies, his laughter filling the air. Just like Emily's once had, he would ask about the lady in the stories, and Emily would smile and say she was brave, she was kind, and she believed that love could heal anything, and he would nod as if he understood more than words could explain. Seasons changed again. Winters came and went. The house grew older, but it never lost its warmth. The roses bloomed faithfully every spring, standing tall. Through every storm, the rocking chair still creaked by the window, and sometimes, when the wind was soft, it sounded like laughter drifting through the walls. Emily often sat there in the evenings with her own gray beginning to show, and her son beside her reading from Mary's journal. She would say, Remember this, my love. Love is not something we keep, it is something we give. And her son would nod, holding her hand, as they watched the sun set beyond the trees. And so the story continued, not in words, but in lives, in kindnesses, given in hearts healed. The love that began with a woman named Mary, who once stood in pain but chose compassion over anger, had become a living legacy passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart. Somewhere in the quiet between sunset and dawn, when the stars looked down over the little house in the hills, it seemed as if the world itself remembered her voice, a soft whisper that said, Forgive, love, begin again. And that was how her story never really ended. It simply became the story of everyone who learned from her that love is the only thing that truly lasts forever. The end.